Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to the next panel, which will focus on geoeconomics in the Indo-Pacific and implications for the Euro-Atlantic security. My name is Plamen Tonchev. I'm head of Asia Unit at the Athens-based Institute of International Economic Relations. And I'm honored and privileged to have two distinguished speakers on this panel, starting from Professor Takahara, who is a distinguished visiting professor at the Tokyo Women's Christian University and professor emeritus at the University of Tokyo. And next to me is Mr. Simon Tay, non-resident ambassador to Greece, and I do hope that you will be here as often as possible, Ambassador. Mr. Tay is also the chairman of the renowned Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Let me kick off with telling you what my bugging question is, something that's really of interest to me. You know, here in Europe, when we look at the map, we have the impression that the Indo-Pacific region is far away. But is it really as remote as it may seem on the map? And are there things that we can actually learn from the Indo-Pacific? If anything, when something happens in your vast region, we can immediately feel the repercussions in Europe as well. And again, if anything, Greece being a power in global shipping, its large commercial fleet does a lot of business in the Indo-Pacific. So I wonder whether we should reconsider this kind of miscalculation or misconception we have of the Indo-Pacific in here in Europe. And I wonder, Professor Takahara, now that we have the US-China standoff, and it's really becoming increasingly intense, to put it mildly, actually, to me, it seems like a sort of a shootout between two cowboys under the hot sun, you know, in a spaghetti western. The difference being that spaghetti westerns are more entertaining, and what's happening these days is actually very serious. And I wonder, perhaps we could ask you how you in the Indo-Pacific manage or fail, you'll tell me, how you manage to navigate this confrontation between China and the United States. I'm sure this is a daily concern of yours.
Well, that's a tremendously large question, but first of all, let me thank the forum organizers and actually the Japanese Embassy and JTI for supporting my visit here. You know, it's been a dream of mine to come to Delphi that I learned much about in high school 50 years ago, so this is fantastic to be here. Now, you know, one foci of US-China competition is Taiwan. So what's going to happen to Taiwan? Now the Chinese don't even hide it. They openly say that they are exerting military pressure on Taiwan. And if there's any Taiwan contingency, be it an attack, invasion, or just a blockade, that's going to disrupt the sea lines of communications very badly. And that is going to affect an enormous percentage of trade that we have now in the world. And that causes a huge tsunami that will cover the whole global economy, I would say. It cannot, you cannot escape from the negative effects of that from happening. So that's how the US-China competition, although indirectly or even directly, will affect your security here in the broad sense of the term. And also, the Chinese have been resorting to means of economic coercion. So in terms of restrictions on trade, be it import or export, you know, in Europe, countries like Norway, countries like Lithuania have been targets of the economic coercive measures by China. We in Asia have more experiences, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, you name it. So how China is going to use its economic clout, I think, has enormous significance to the European countries too. And will they do that in the context of their competition with the United States? So everything is connected nowadays.
Indeed it is, and thanks very much, Professor Takahara, for bringing up Taiwan as a major flashpoint arguably the most dangerous flashpoint in the world, and I'm taking your word about tsunami that could be caused in case of a conflict over there. But speaking of trade and economic coercion, I wonder, Mr. Tay, whether President Trump believes that the two most beautiful words are deal and tariffs. And I wonder whether, given that all the tariff he's announcing and occasionally freezing, whether one should pursue a deal with the states or whether one should stand up to Washington and strike back. What would your view on this be?
Well, let me first go back to your opening statement of how we see the connections and comparisons between the EU and my part of the world. When I came here, I was delighted to be at the classically navel of the world. And in this Delphi forum, I'm astonished by the depth and breadth of discussions here. The Middle East, problems within the EU itself, the development of Greece, as you know, this country dramatically grown in scale and ambition over the last years of this government. And of course, the Americans, who Greece is an ally with, the EU is part wedded in NATO, and so are we in our part of the world. And of course, this tariffs you brought up. So I have no doubt that there are important connections between the Indo-Pacific and the EU in geoeconomics as well as security. And there are some conceptual differences. He's mentioned Taiwan, which I agree. I go to Taiwan often. I meet them and sympathize with them. But I, sitting in Europe, feel a stronger pulse of actual conflict. The concern with Ukraine, long-standing. From Greece particularly, you feel the connection to the Middle East and what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And I think these are, at a moment, a different level of problems we have. So then come to the broader question of what can we perhaps share notes. I think one of them is that we have learned in the Indo-Pacific to rely on America as an offshore balancer, not an alliance, except for Japan and a few other countries, for the whole region, not NATO. But very importantly, and we have begun to feel, even though it makes us uncomfortable, a slight shift, not only in these present tariffs, but over perhaps the last decade. And I do not regard this as something I welcome. I'd rather it be otherwise, but a lot of it is up to America. Now, I think take the point about China. For many of us, we really have got beyond the point of being naive about China. You mentioned Trump's tariffs, and similarly, there are Chinese economic coercion. Bananas left in pots to rot for no reason, other than to punish a fellow Asian. So without being naive about China or America that is changing, we have got to respond inclusively. I come from the Southeast Asia. ASEAN is often overlooked, even when Europeans look at Asia. They see China, of course. India has been really grabbing a lot of headlines, a lot of interest, and both these giants deserve it. But my region of 660 million people is important for the market, but also for our idea of what security is. And unusually, it is part of the connection of how we link to the big Northeast Asian three, and of course, Australia and New Zealand down south. And while they're not part of the regional partnership, India is a close friend of Southeast Asia. So I think that this approach of being inclusive and much as possible without being naive about some of potential rivalries and bullying, I think this is critical for us to work on.
Thanks very much, Mr. Tay. I'm taking your point about economic security. In fact, you spoke about security, added the adjective economic security. But I also taking your point about ASEAN, which may have been neglected and certainly not paid significant attention to. I wonder, Professor Takahara, speaking of economic security and ASEAN, which is a large regional organization, whether all this standoff and all these tariffs, whether they could actually trigger a process of regionalism in both, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific at large, and whether actually this could have a positive effect, in terms of regional integration.
Well, you know, when we think about regionalism, we think about Europe as one chunk, Southeast Asia perhaps connecting with Northeast Asia, East Asia as one chunk, America, North America, South America. But now what's happening, I think, is this attempt, as this panel shows, how Asia and Europe can link up. So it's a new kind of regionalism, if you want to call it regionalism. And it's a big question. The trend is, because of these tariffs coming from the new Trump administration, we are thinking in that direction. But we should make sure that we are not going back to the 20th century when bloc formation led to war. So, you know, Japan for many years were not for regional arrangements because we thought that free trade is important, but it should be global. And that's why for many years, the Japanese did not adopt a regional FTA kind of a policy.
Right.
But then the thinking changed. Regional FTAs are not the stumbling blocks, but the building blocks for a global FTA. And then we changed our policy. So we don't want to forget this, the important history of not going back to the pre-war days.
Thanks very much. I know we happened to have a chat with Dr. Tay before this panel, and I know that you already hinted at that, cooperation between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And I wonder whether one of the unintended, perhaps unexpected positive impacts of all these developments could be closer cooperation between the Indo-Pacific and Europe.
Yes.
Could it be that, in fact, because of this more difficult access to the American market, you know, Indo-Pacific countries could actually look at Europe, and Europe could also look at the Indo-Pacific in a more positive light?
Yes. I appreciate the question. I think it's on everybody's mind, including Europeans. My view is that there is absolutely zero substitute for America, both now and in the future. Economically, as a final demand, with a lot of the strengths they have in R&D, size of companies, the pattern of capitalism. But if America doesn't want to play, who can persuade it? That is the challenge. So I think for us and Europe, it's looking at plan B. This is not what we actually want, but we can't just be waiting and waiting. We have to figure out what else we can do. Within that, I think ASEAN and Asia's plan B is already in place with the regional agreements you talked about, the regional comprehensive economic partnership, or even the CPTPP, which Japan led. I played a small role in this when I helped negotiate Japan's first FTA with Singapore, convincing Asians to work with Asians. But let me therefore say it is really plan B when the global fails us. Plan B plus would take us to your territory. The EU has talked about an FTA, a free trade agreement with ASEAN for a long time. There have been stumbling blocks. It's not purely on EU's fault. Singapore is already an FTA. In fact, I have to go back and help keep it going, and with Vietnam as well. And so this is something that we really need to talk about and move forward with. When I'm in Singapore, I find a lot of European companies interested. When I see the big economies of EU, Germany, France, and not part of the EU anymore, but in Europe, the UK, clearly Asians are interested. I think the new dimension might be to have a more total engagement, where, like Greece, Central Europe, these have been, from our perspective, overlooked. I think in the world that's emerging with America making certain demands, we'll have to look at it again and work closely together. And one more thing about working together, I'm hoping that this will be very rules-based. What you talked about, the World Trade Organization, it's not just a question of who you're siding with, but what rules you're observing. And so similarly, if the EU has certain rules which we can't accept, or China does, I think we need to be very transparent about it, call them out.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tay. I think that we've already given you enough food for thought. Do feel free to raise your hand and ask questions or make some comments. If you do so, I will kindly ask you to state your name and your affiliation.
Can I just
yes,
add
please,
two things?
Yes, Professor Takahara.
You know, when the late Prime Minister Abe came up with this concept of the Indo-Pacific, the idea was to connect Africa and Asia, the two promising growth fields of the world economy. And it's going to be the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean connected that will combine all the area as one. And have we forgotten about Europe? Not really. You know, look at the UK. The UK has joined the CPTPP. And I think it will be a very good idea for more European countries to follow that way. And we will form a big, we can change the name, it doesn't have to be TPP, but a new arrangement, you know, that all of us can enjoy the benefits of it.
Point taken. Thanks very much, Professor Takahara. Any volunteer who wants to ask a question? No. Please.
Yes, hello, John Laderos from Sophocles Inn. We have heard many things about the trade of goods. What is your position and your views on the trade of services?
I suppose you mean the trade of services between Europe and what, the
Europe
Indo-Pacific,
and the
Indo-Pacific region?
Yes.
Yes. I wonder whether you would like to take the floor, please.
I think clearly as a professor, I believe this is really the huge, unexplored dimension of trade. There is so much that can be done. But there are real sensitivities of this given Asia's position. There aren't enough professionals. There aren't enough, especially in the new areas of technology and in green services. So I think that this is something that we need to approach at the right time. Right now, I think trade in goods should be sped up, particularly goods that would help us all move towards a green economy. So even if the broad FTA can't be done, I think a sectoral one which has a certain progressive tint, sustainability or other areas, with something very dramatic to move on. My country is an exception. I think we are very open to foreign talent. Trade in goods as well. We trade about 300% of our GDP, whereas, you know, continental countries trade about like 25, 30%. So we will feel the pain of these present shifts, but the solution will probably have to be quite a staged opening rather than to simply open to all. One of the problems will be, additionally, opening to China at the present point, given the deflationary pressures from their exports. If they can't go to America, will they divert those very cheap goods into the rest of Asia and to Europe? And if so, what legal defenses are there to that, perhaps emergency measures?
Right. Anyone else? If not, then I've got a couple of questions. Back to Professor Takahara. I did take note of your reference to Taiwan as a major flashpoint. So far, we've been speaking about trade, and maybe we should speak about hardcore security. And what do you think is needed for Europe to fully understand the implications of a potential, God forbid, potential conflict around Taiwan?
Yes.
You spoke about a potential tsunami in economic terms, but could there be other implications as well that we should be aware of?
I think, in fact, many European countries have understood the point that I was trying to make, and that's why many European countries have started to send their naval vessels to our part of the world. You know, it could not function perhaps perfectly as deterrence measures. However, it's a very important signal to China. Don't use your fist, you know, don't do anything physically, because that's going to disrupt not only the economies of the region, but it's going to affect the European economy in a very bad way too.
Right.
If I could chip in on that.
Please.
I do have a lot of empathy for Taiwan. There are actually only 3 islands in the world where the Chinese majority are Hokkien, a particular dialect of China. Taiwan, Penang in Malaysia, and Singapore. We are the only independent republic. I do spend a lot of time there, and I encourage them to take their defense seriously. They underspend. They have national service which lasts less than a year. Singapore, with no clear enemy, our men spend 2 years in the national service, armed forces. But more importantly, I think Taiwan has to really figure out how to find that path, which does not mean returning to the mainland on the mainland's terms, but without provoking the mainland to a terrible war for the region and for each other. They've got to take kind of ownership over a relationship that could actually be quite stable. It has been for periods. It's come through a period of real instability today, which is why I agree with Takahara that at the moment it looks like one of the red flashing dots in our region. Broadly speaking, I think that the peace we've relatively had in Asia can be maintained with American presence in the past, but we have to deal with the fact that America may be less committed or less certainly committed than it has been. And so we've got to figure out how to have the habits of peace amongst ourselves. Not just Taiwan, but even brewing. A rivalry between India and China is a horrific thing to think about. They have had squabbles and skirmishes on the north high plateau of the Himalayas. It could happen again, and control over the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific in that sense, is something else that Indian strategic thinkers are worried about. So I think this really is a time where if America it seems a bit more uncertain compared to America we've known before, the Asians have got to figure out what to do for themselves. And if there are analogies to EU, I'm not here to teach you anything, but I leave it to you whether there are analogies.
Thanks very much. Any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Could you give the lady a mic, please?
Thank you. My name is Konstantina. I'm from the American College of Greece. I have a question. Do you believe that there is a way somehow the European countries with the Indo-Pacific ones create relationship to subsidize from the losses of the United States, to subsidize from the losses of the tariffs? Thank you.
Basically,
whom are you addressing this question to?
Either of us.
Please.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
I think, first of all, what I said about America having no substitute, it is still the largest market in terms of consumer power. So final demand, the typical pattern for Asian production is we sort of produce amongst ourselves little intermediate parts. The final assembly is done by China, and then it gets sent across the ocean, probably on a Greek vessel, to Long Beach or other ports. And that's where we've tried to change the game a bit, and we need to do more of Asia's demand. There is a relatively growing middle class, or a higher class, depending on the wealth range. For example, when I buy home appliances, I always look at European brands like Miele, etc. Because my family likes expensive things. So I think there is a lot of ground to grow the trade. And on our side too, there's a lot of demand for certain infrastructure, certain products which Europeans are good at, city planning, all these things. So I think these are areas where we could grow. But to be clear, there is really, again, I will say it, no substitute for America at present.
All right. I cannot resist the temptation to ask you about the South China Sea. If anything, it's a major trade route. And Greece, by the way, is very much interested in that because some 60% of the EU's shipping capacity, that's the Greek shipping the commercial fleet. So you do have Greek ships, sailing all the seas and oceans in the Indo-Pacific, and the South China Sea is yet another potential flashpoint. I wonder, Professor Takahara, if you have a view on this. To what extent we should, apart from shipping companies, to what extent Europeans should be sensitized, to the importance of this potential flashpoint?
Well, I wonder what we can do to enhance the consciousness amongst the Europeans as to the importance of this question. We can cite figures, like 40% of world trade goes through the South China Sea and things like that. But if there is a more visually impactful something, and I think that would be better. Maybe I can show a slide, you know, of the artificial islands that the Chinese are creating, or what. But I'd rather ask for a lot of wisdom from you.
Right.
How can we impress the European friends as to the importance of the South China Sea?
All right. We have...
Right.
Please, go ahead.
Singapore is a major shipping country, and I'm proud to say that a lot of the Greek companies you talked about have a second home in Singapore. And because we're positioned that way for transshipment and bulk carriers, we carry a lot of the trade, not just for ourselves, we're a small country, but for the whole region. So we are concerned about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. But just to clarify, I would say the shipping industry faces so many challenges today. While we were here in this wonderful place, the IMO are meeting in London discussing what to do about climate pricing, and the American Trump administration has sent a torpedo about the possible agreement on climate pricing, carbon pricing. So I think the industry as a whole has been remarkably resilient, remarkably brave, the Greek ship owners particularly, and I think they will have to adjust. The South China Sea, in that sense, is a potential choke point, but I wouldn't say it's the only issue on the table for them. There are a lot of issues where the governments have got to come in to really support this major industry, not just for Greece, but really, as you said, a huge, about 80% of the world's trade is carried by sea. And if we have choke points, whether political or climate or other things, it will be very, very difficult.
Thanks very much. Is there any burning desire for a last-minute question? Please, and be very short. We have 3 minutes to go.
I won't wait for the microphone. My name is Brian Timrock. I'm from the American Embassy. We've talked about Taiwan as a flashpoint, but the United States has a robust unofficial relationship with Taiwan across a number of sectors. It's a democracy, like many of the Greece and many European countries. It's also a leader in high-tech sectors. Japan and Singapore have robust interaction with Taiwan as well. What opportunities do you see for European countries for engagement with Taiwan?
I think, thanks very much, and I think this is a perfect opportunity for both speakers to have a concluding remark in answering this question. We have 2.5 minutes to go.
Which order do you want?
So, a minute each, please.
Me first? Oh,
Please,
okay.
Dr. Tai.
I think that first, Taiwan is a big question for the whole region and the world, not just because of chips, but this idea that there can be a degree of association with historical links, etc., without necessarily being under the thumb, to be a different pattern from what we've seen in Hong Kong. I wish the Taiwanese people very well, but how do we counsel them? If they will have counsel, of course, they are their own sort of, attitude to the mainland, which has changed over time, depending on China's attitude to Taiwan too. So in that sense, I do hope that whether it's the Europeans or fellow Asians, we will not necessarily push Taiwan in too strong direction either way. It is up to them and the mainland primarily. There are American advisors now in Taiwan. There are Japanese active diplomacy. I think that this is all to the good to reassure them. But if they were to sort of push them forward, I would counsel my Taiwanese friends not to do so.
I think that's a very clear point. Thanks very much, Dr. Tai. Professor Takahara, a minute, please.
Yes, Taiwan is very important to the world as a model case of democratized society. And it's very important for us, for all those who treasure democratic values, to pay a lot of attention to what goes on around Taiwan. And I believe that all the European countries are very much interested in preserving the rules-based order and the values that support the system that we have today. So please focus on Taiwan.
I think that these are huge questions which we managed to squeeze into 30 minutes. It wasn't too bad, was it? Can I thank our distinguished speakers and hope you did enjoy, and I hope that you did take notes out of this panel and this discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you.